Well, I haven't done one of these in a while, right? Um, Rating draft picks is fun, just like rating players is fun in general. And for this one, I'm looking at the number 5 overall pick. This goes back to 1963, but drafts were more important later in history. 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, late 70s, early 70s, basically everything but the 60s. So let's take a look at this. Now, honorable mentions go to Damon Lanko, Eric Brewer, Rob Niedermeyer, and Tom Connolly. Or Tim Connolly. Tim Connolly likely would have been on this list if he'd been healthy his entire career, but injuries shortened that up. And then when he wasn't himself the last couple of years, he did play in the NHL. Number 15. Peter Svoboda was drafted by Montreal in 1984 and went on to be a pretty decent defenseman. Um, and played both ends of the ice, which you have to in Montreal. And yeah, he's known now more. I believe the Peter Svoboda that's the agent is the same guy who was the player. Svoboda, though, I believe is a relatively common name. So, well, I'm not guaranteeing, but I'm pretty sure it's the same guy. Anyways, Svoboda went on to a pretty decent career in Montreal and should be well thought of, I would think, about Montreal fans. You guys can let me know in the comment section below if he's well thought of. Number 14. Not well thought of. Yeah. Darius Kasperitis would be known for his controversial hits as much as anything else. And there are some players who are playing now that make controversial plays, and I get asked, well, are they going to be remembered for that? Or yeah, probably. Casper is one of those guys. Excellent shutdown defenseman, one of the best shutdown defensemen of his time, but some of those plays, some of the things he did, made him less than popular. Number 13, and getting into guys whose careers were too short. If he watches this, I'd love to have him higher, but the numbers dictate that since this is a measure of a player's entire career, Jeff ONeal and the promise he showed as a Hartford Whaler early on was never really fully realized. He had some good seasons. He's on the list for a reason. He had some good seasons, but again, a career that was cut short, and a guy who, on the right organization could have been a linchpin to a Stanley Cup, but it's just that's the way that it goes. Is that sometimes you get all the breaks and you play a lot of games, like the guy who leads this list, and then sometimes you don't get the breaks, and you don't end up playing as many. Number 12. I went back and forth on this, but you know what's funny is that there are people who overrate Morgan Rielly, but I think there's a lot of people that underrate him as well. So for me, Morgan Rielly belongs right here. He has had a very solid start to his career. I don't know that he's necessarily a guy that, if the Leafs are going to win a Stanley Cup, can be the number one defenseman. But I haven't seen him lose them anything. Like when we look at the Game 7 loss to Boston a few months ago, I don't look at Rielly and point a finger in his direction. Rielly played very well, and he seems to always play very well. Now, again, when you're comparing him with, and there's a guy on this list that's got some cups to his name, that's the question mark. Is can he become as big a star as some of these other guys who've won Norris trophies and Stanley Cups and been that big name on the list? Is Morgan Rielly of that ilk, or is he just an excellent top four defenseman? Number 11. I went back and forth on this one too. I've actually been sitting on this list for, I want to say a month. I want to say it's been a month I've sat on this list. 2009. Braden Schen's drafted by the Kings. Wouldn't be a star for the Kings. Goes to the Flyers. Some good times with the Flyers, but this past season in St. Louis, he looked like a star. Now, the question becomes one of, can he follow that up and have another stellar season right after? And that can be tricky. That can be tricky. And with the amount of offense that St. Louis added, it would be easy for him to watch his totals kind of drop both for ice time and for points. So, we'll see if he can follow up with another fantastic season, then yeah, he would move up this list. But based on the one fantastic season, I have to put him ahead of the other guys. Number 10. Went back and forth on this one, too. Rick Martin. Rick Martin of the Buffalo Sabres, 1971. And played a key role. 50 goal scorer for the Buffalo Sabres, 95 points. Played a key role in helping them get to a Stanley Cup final at a point that we'll get to in my history videos, which everybody's watching. And Martin was an excellent player. It was funny with him, and this is a funny thing about players in the late 70s and early 80s, and even into the mid 80s somewhat, is you'd watch a guy have this stellar career and then all of a sudden it would stop. All of a sudden it was gone and they'd be retired. And you don't see that as much now, and I think that has to do with conditioning. I think that has to do a lot with conditioning. If Martin had played now, who knows how long he would have played. But solid career, top 10 for sure. Shame he didn't end up with a Stanley Cup ring. It would have been nice if Buffalo had won a Stanley Cup at some point in the 70s, so we're not hearing about how Buffalo and Vancouver is kind of a jinxed expansion, but that's where we are. Number 9. Thomas Vanek, drafted by Buffalo in 2003. And do you know what gets me with these lists? Is looking over them and seeing how many times Buffalo and Montreal shows up on these lists. It's kind of stunning. It means Buffalo over decades has had an excellent scouting staff. They've known exactly who to get with the top draft picks when they have them. Vanek has had an excellent career, and really overall, this is an overall thing. If we were just going by greatest seasons, Martin would be ahead of Vanek. Might even be ahead of the guy who's at 8th. But Vanek over his career has been excellent. He had a somewhat of a renaissance this past season with Vancouver and then Columbus, and I think he's going to be a solid addition for Detroit as well. Number 8. When the Boston Bruins drafted Phil Kessel, I don't think any of us knew what was to come. Kessel's time in Boston would be short. He goes to Toronto. Toronto fans remember his time in Toronto well. It's been well documented everywhere else. I don't need to document it here. And then he ends up in Pittsburgh, wins 2 Stanley Cups his first 2 years, and now he's going into this season looking for 3 and 4. I don't think he's done eating hot dogs out of a Stanley Cup. I don't think he wants to be done. And there's a competitive nature to Phil Kessel that has always sort of been there. I know that it didn't always show up in Toronto, but I think it was more... I think he looked at the team that was around him. I think he got tired of answering questions from the press all the time. And I don't think he's the guy that wants to be the face of the team. But as a support guy, he'll get you 40 goals. As a support guy, or at least he'll score on that pace for a while. He might end up with 30, but it looks like he's a 40-goal scorer. And I used to have arguments with Leaf fans years back before I had a channel about how great a goal scorer Kessel was. And according to Leaf fans at the time, Kessel was one of the greatest in the game. And there were different stats they'd pull for that. And I never argued that he wasn't a great goal scorer, just the consistency was where the issue was for me with Kessel. Number 7. So, Phoenix drafts Blake Wheeler in 2004. Wheeler balks at the Coyotes, ends up in Boston. And played pretty darn well for Boston. Boston ends up moving him out to Winnipeg in a deal that I really think it came down to cap. Boston had a lot of cap problems. But Blake Wheeler's put up some excellent numbers. And you could argue, and this is an ongoing argument, the Winnipeg Jets have Laine, they have Scheifele, and they have Wheeler. Any of the three, you could argue, would be the MVP candidate for this coming year if they're going to win in the playoffs and actually get to a Stanley Cup. You could argue that Wheeler needs to be the guy. You could argue Laine needs to be the guy, or that Scheifele needs to be. Now, if all three of them have an excellent playoff, there could be a Stanley Cup parade in Winnipeg. And it starts with 2004, Blake Wheeler being drafted by Phoenix, which he was not happy about from day one. Number 6 on the list. In 2005, Carey Price is drafted 5th overall by the Montreal Canadiens. And he's had an excellent career. Not just one excellent season, he's had an excellent career. He's coming off of a down year. And he is at a stage where if injuries have slowed him, if injuries have caused him to have some sort of issue, this could be as high as he ever climbs on this list. But I can't see him dropping down unless Wheeler has a fantastic season and wins a Stanley Cup, or somebody who's not yet on this list because they're very early in their career becomes this big, huge, stellar. Maybe Barrett Hayton. Arizona just drafted him, maybe. But Carey Price for me is 6th, based on his career to this point. Number 5, staying with goaltenders. I talk a lot about guys who aren't in the Hall of Fame and should be. And for me, Tom Barrasso's on that list. He won trophies. He won Stanley Cups. He played almost 800 games in the NHL. He was the backbone of one of the 2 Pittsburgh Penguins Stanley Cups. Could have won the Conn Smythe. And honestly, Barrasso is a guy who was maligned a lot for his prickly personality, let's say. Not exactly the most approachable guy in a locker room. But that really shouldn't keep a guy from being in the Hall. And I hope that's not what it is. Brasel, though, had excellent numbers. As I said, he won trophies. And there are guys in the Hall that I would argue that Brasel was better than. But that's my personal argument. And I'm not going to have that here. This definitely isn't a place to discuss greatest goalies and where they should be. But Brasel would be. And I'll say this, too. I have advocated before that Andy Moog should be in the Hall of Fame. I would put Barrasso in the Hall of Fame before Moog. I think Barrasso did more than Moog, even though I think in the wins list, I think Moog is ahead of Barrasso, but I would have Barrasso in the Hall first. So there you go. Number 4. This is where I really got torn on this. I'm going to explain this. Maybe I should put both up. Yeah, I'll put 4 and 3 up. Because I think these guys are close. They're 10 years apart in draft date. But Rick Vive and Bill Garin, that's close. Vancouver drafted Rick Vive and then decided that his goal-scoring prowess was too much for the rest of the Canucks, and he was making everybody else look bad. So they moved him to Toronto for Tiger Williams, who then said, haha, I can score 2 and got 35 goals that first year in Vancouver. And they threw in Bill Derlego, and they got back Jerry Butler. It was not a great trade. Bill Garin went on to a much longer career than Vive. But if you look at them at their peak, Vive is a fantastic goal scorer. The issue with that becomes, yeah, but it was during the 80s, so does it really count? So you could make an argument for Vive at 3 for his time in Toronto and for what he did trying to keep that team above water. Or you could argue that Garin is the better player overall and belongs there. So 3-4 for me is really, really quite close. And Rick Vive went on to a pretty solid run with Buffalo after he left Toronto, but his best years were in Toronto. And he did that on a team that really wasn't that great. Rick Vive was just simply a fantastic player on a team that wasn't that great. But again, you could argue Vive at 3, you could argue Garin at 3, and so I'm going to put them both up there. I'm going to leave them with Garin over Vive, because for me, Garin is barely ahead of Vive, but it's close. Number 2. In 1982, the Washington Capitals drafted Scott Stevens. Stevens' travels through the NHL would be weird. He'd go to St. Louis, and then he'd go to New Jersey. And in both cases, they were strange transactions. He would be best known for what he did in New Jersey. He would be known for his thundering hits. He would be known for being a Stanley Cup winner. And during his time in St. Louis, he was simply one of the most dominant defensemen in the league. And he was pretty darn good in Washington, too, while we're at it. Scott Stevens is a Hall of Famer. Is, for me, the only defenseman I look at from this current point in time and say he could be another Scott Stevens when we look back on his career is Drew Doughty, where he does a little bit of everything. And there's those hits. There are those moments where you say, man, he really crossed the line there. And Stevens hitting changed the course of NHL history. The hits on Lindros and the hit on Korea especially changed everything. That was when the NHL looked and went, that hit's clean, but it shouldn't be. We need to look at the rules. And that was where the conversation about concussions, headshots, and the open ice body check really started to gain steam. And yet Stevens is still a Hall of Famer. One of the greatest of all time. And even without the hits, if you look at his play on the power play, his overall totals, the dude's a Hall of Famer. Number one, this isn't close. It's not close. Jágr dropped to fifth. Jágr would have gone, I think, sooner if teams had known exactly when Jágr was going to come over. Pittsburgh bounced out of their seats and couldn't run up and select Jágr fast enough when he was there at number 5. Of course, with hindsight being 2020, the Quebec Nordiques would have drafted Jágr first instead of Owen Nolan. Owen Nolan went on to a pretty darn good career too, but of the two, I would take Jágr over Nolan going away. And I think everybody would. And again, it's not really close. This is a guy who's number 2 in games played. He's number 2 in points. He is absolutely one of the greatest players of all time. And you have to think that if he hadn't gone to the KHL, if he'd played his entire career in the NHL, he would easily have passed 2,000 points. He would likely have played about 2,000 games. And Jágr, I don't know that they necessarily would have decided. See, that's the thing too. I always ask this question of myself. You have the waiting period of, I believe it's 3 years before you're eligible for the Hall of Fame. You retire and 3 years later you're eligible. I wonder if they'll waive it for Jágr. And I wonder if he'd hit 2,000 points, if that would have made it more likely for them to waive it than otherwise. I do think it gets waived. I think when Jágr announces he's done, which will probably be in another 10 years, I think he immediately gets into the Hall. But he is one of the greatest players of all time. And I couldn't stand him when he was younger. That's the funny thing. I couldn't stand him when he was younger on Pittsburgh. I thought he was cocky. I thought he was arrogant. I thought he was a jerk. And then as his career went along, he matured really, really well. To the point where by the time he leaves the game, he's one of the most beloved guys in the game. Which shows that, yes, young players that might be impetuous, and you might look at right now and say, man, this guy's a jerk. We can't wait to get him off the team. Maybe you should just ride it out. And as the years go by, they'll get better. And you may end up with a real superstar in your hands that you look brilliant for holding on to him. So there you go. The top 15 number 5 draft picks of all time. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.